I'm Andrew Kitley, and this is my podcast, The Invisible Gift, a show about turning disability into possibility. From a young age, I was told I had a disability that would make it impossible for me to achieve and flourish in life. I struggled in school and felt I was not truly understood or supported. On my long road to becoming the owner of multiple businesses, I have learnt that dyslexia was not my disability, but rather my invisible gift. My dyslexia challenged me every day, but it was also what made me into an independent thinker, a creative, and gave me that hard-working mindset that has taught me to never be discouraged by failure. I realised there are many people out there just like me. So I wanted to learn more about them and dyslexia itself. I realised I needed a way to do this which was great for dyslexics, which obviously rules out writing anything down and makes total sense why a podcast is perfect. I'm excited to be sharing this journey with you as we learn more about dyslexia, the incredible people that thrive with it, and how we can all transform our greatest challenge into our invisible gift. Welcome to my podcast. This week on the podcast, I'm joined by one of the biggest academic voices on dyslexia, Rod Nicolson. Rod is a professor of psychology at the University of Sheffield and has been researching dyslexia since 1987. He's published some of the most important books on the subject and has been so important in shifting the negatives of dyslexia to the positives. We spoke extensively about how the perceptions of dyslexia have changed in schools, while classifying dyslexia as a disability no longer works, and we investigated exactly what's going on in the brain of a dyslexic. First of all, let's find out how he began his research.
So, Rod, thank you for coming on. I'm really excited about this chat because everyone I've spoken to is generally a sufferer from dyslexia, and we don't really understand why things are the way they are. And I think you're going to be able to help a lot of people here. So hopefully, we're going to see some real good information coming out of you. So thank you for coming on.
Then.
No pressure whatsoever.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I have to say though that whether one is dyslexic or not, the universe does not always make sense.
No, quite. So what got you into this in the first place? What made you decide to get into this field and buckle down on it?
The reason I got into this is a very good question, is that I was a well-established academic at the University of Sheffield in the psychology department, and I inherited a PhD student, Angela Fawcett, who is the wife and mother of dyslexic people, and she had gone to university to try to understand what dyslexia was all about. And so I worked with her in her PhD, and we came up with some really interesting new ideas. And I got fascinated by, individual differences, really, and dyslexia in particular. And we were lucky enough to come up with some, I think, still very good theories for what the underlying causes are. And Angela and I plugged away at this for ages. And then more recently, I thought, we've just been working on what goes wrong for dyslexic people. What we really need to look at is the other side of the coin. What really should go right for dyslexic people, and how can, in a sense, square that circle so we'd make sure that things go right for dyslexic people rather than wrong for them.
There's been some huge changes in dyslexia, the way dyslexia is noticed in schools now. What would you say the biggest changes has been in the last 20 years in dyslexia?
I noticed the changes particularly. We were lucky enough to be involved in the first sort of raft of changes, where through exploiting the sort of disability links, we were able to get legislation through Parliament that schools had to support dyslexic children. And then later on, of course, workplaces have to support dyslexic employees. So it was one of those things came in the mid-90s where schools are required to do it, but were not given the funds to do it properly. And that, I'm afraid, has been pretty much the case ever since. It has become an obligation to do testing, but the necessary funding has not been there because I don't think that the government has taken it seriously enough.
So you said earlier on that you've kind of, through your research when you started this, you kind of found um, what are some of the causes of dyslexia. That I was a bit excited. I should have asked you that when you said it. But what do you think some of the causes are of it then?
Well, we were trying to sort of see what the symptoms are first, because it's a bit like
Hmm.
medicine. If you don't really know what the symptoms are, you might just sort of leap to the wrong underlying cause and then do the wrong underlying cure, if you see what I mean. So we just thought, let's have a look at what the symptoms are. And we looked at dyslexic people, children mostly, and sure enough, they had problems reading, which is not a surprise. But they also tended to have problems in various other skills, and they had problems in some things like executive function, so slightly slower speed of processing, maybe forget things a bit faster. But we also found that for quite a few dyslexic children, they were also showing slightly sort of delayed motor physical function. And so they might be a bit slower to pick up a skill here and there. Everybody has known that dyslexic kids have problems with the phonology, hearing the sounds in the words. But we also found that a lot of the dyslexic kids have problems in the writing and in general putting things together. And we were able to put together a really simple theory that sort of captured most of that by saying that dyslexic children have take longer to get their skills automatic. So people who've learned to drive a car, that will be what you remember. It's actually terribly hard at first because you're having to think about, oh, I've got to change gear, oh, I've got to stay on the road, I've got to move the steering wheel. But after a while, it all becomes smooth and automatic. And our general theory was that for dyslexic children, for whatever reason, they take longer to get their skills automatic. It doesn't mean the skills are going to be less good, but it just means that they'll take longer to get there. And so if you're trying to build on top of that not automatic skill to get to the next level, it's not solid, and that causes problems.
Have you noticed that dyslexic people, because again, through talking to people, it seems to be whenever I ask someone who is dyslexic, especially, well, I obviously know myself, but when I speak to a lot of people, they seem to fall more on the creative side of doing things.
Yes.
So is there a link? Is there a neurological link to that?
Well, that's a really interesting question. We've the standard view of dyslexia is that dyslexia is a deficit, and you've got to explain what the weaknesses are, because then you help with the weaknesses. One of the major developments in psychology this century was the introduction of a thing called positive psychology, where rather than focusing on your weaknesses and trying to strengthen your weaknesses, what you do is you focus on your strengths, because everybody likes to focus on their strengths. And if you can actually devote your life to working at things you're good at, it's so much more satisfactory than devoting your life to being less bad at the stuff you're not very good at. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not rocket science, as you'll see. But of course, so that then got me onto a thing which I then, at that time, I called positive dyslexia. Find what the strengths of the dyslexic adults and children are, so that they can then realize what this, because that's one of the real problems in life. You very rarely realize what your strengths are, but you very easily realize what your weaknesses are. And for a dyslexic person, they often think they have no strengths at all. But if you can say, actually, you're pretty creative, that's the sort of thing that can really turn round that dark period in time when the dyslexic child is having to go to school, because it gives them a bit of a beacon of hope. You're creative, or you're really good at explaining things. So that was how I got into it.
So I listened to TED Talk by Sir Ken Robinson, who sadly died very recently, and he spoke about creativity in the academics and how it's put a lot lower than the core subjects. And do you think there's a link with how education is focused on the more core subjects and less concentrated on the creative subjects? That it kind of sets an example for dyslexics to be less feel less important in the future roles because the creativity is not really pushed when you're younger.
And definitely, I think that's a very important point. That, in a sense, that those classroom skills of listening carefully what you're supposed to be doing, and then doing them neatly, etc., etc. Those are the ones that tend to get reinforced at school. and the more creative ones are very rarely reinforced. It's difficult to have a classroom full of 30 really creative people doing different things, if you see what I mean. And the curriculum has been designed around what I would call the 19th and 20th century skills, which do require sort of that convergent thinking rather than the divergent creative thinking.
I asked this question to someone I interviewed the other day, and I wonder what your thoughts are on it. If with the education system, obviously they're constantly looking for ways to improve it. And as you did say, there's budget issues, but they're never going to go away. So, who do you think is the best people to develop new dyslexic teaching skills? Do you think it would be better as a joint venture with dyslexic people, or is it better for the teachers and associations to come together and do it?
Well, I have the simple answer to that, which is, of course, your first one. I believe that dyslexic people are really good at designing systems that not just suit dyslexic people, but suit everybody much better than the systems which are designed to suit people who are not dyslexic. But I have a longer answer to that one, if I could have a go at that, which gets us onto the work that we did on strengths, because it is in general thought. It is a lot. There are three parts to this, so my apologies. But the first part is what are the strengths, and then the second part is why should anyone care whether people develop these strengths, and then how do we actually get these strengths into our curriculum? So the first part was what are the strengths, and we did some quite extensive studies with successful dyslexic adults. And we came up with this is my PhD students and myself, Sarah Agahi and Polly Sepulveda, and we came up with what I've called the dyslexia decathlon. Now, you'll be very familiar with some of the strengths of creativity. These are sort of what I would call mental strengths. And we came up with three of those. So there is the creativity and innovation, and there is that sort of that visual ability, the visualization, being able to see things in 3D, but also being able to sort of map a route forward, which is an important one, to visualize things. So that was the second one. And then the third one is the big picture thinking, which is linked a bit to visualization, but being able to not get bogged down in the details, but trying to see the big picture. So that was three. And then we came up with three work strengths. And this is interesting stuff. One of them was we were interviewing successful dyslexic adults, right? So they were all doing well, like yourself. The three that came across from that was determination and resilience, because you need that to plow through the rubbish that you gets thrown at you. The second one was proactivity, thinking ahead. What will I need in this meeting? Because I'm not going to be able to read it at the last minute. So thinking ahead, these are really useful skills. And then the third one, you'll enjoy this, is flexible coping. When something goes wrong, the dyslexic people are good at fixing it because they've had a lot more practice.
You've just basically summed up everything.
So those are the three work strengths. And then the three social strengths you're really interested in, because often you do sort of mental, social work. And so between people's strengths, there was teamwork. I think because dyslexic people are used to actually being a bit weak at something, they find someone who's good at it, and they get good at picking what people are good at. And that really does make you a really good at a team player.
Because when I was at school, I couldn't do homework, and I was never going to do the homework. It wasn't possible for me to do it. So I got friends to help me do it, and we would always exchange something. It would never money or anything. We would just exchange. I'll do something for them if they done my homework. And I always said Richard Branson always made this point about he used to get people to do things. He became very good at getting other people to do things for him. And I think that's the strength that I've gained. And I think that comes back to your point about that teamwork.
That's what one hears, isn't it? You get good at seeing who's good at doing the stuff that you need, and you get good at actually giving them credit for it as well, which is actually, again, it's not a a standard characteristic.
Whenever I employ anyone, I always say, have they got opposite strengths to me? And are they better than me? And when I speak to my friends who aren't dyslexic and they run businesses, they have a fear of employing someone who's more intelligent than them. So they generally employ someone that they've got to manage, they've got to mentor.
It's what happens in academia a lot. You employ clones, if you see what I mean. People who show exactly the same characteristics as yourself. And of course, for dyslexia, you don't get that problem.
No.
And then the third one, which is one of the social skills that you've mentioned in passing, I think, is that sort of communication sort of idea, being able to explain things, the sort of the big picture. This is what we're trying to achieve, and then to explain things in terms of pictures is really powerful. So that was the 9, if you see what I mean. And then on top of that, of course, one has thinking outside the box, thinking more in parallel rather than one step at a time, which is sort of the 10th one for the decathlon, is thinking differently. Not all dyslexic people will have all of these. Some dyslexic people might not have any, but what you've got to do is to find out what your top strength is and try to do it that way.
So they're the three processes you come up in your experiment with your PhD students.
Well, yes, that's correct. And so we ended up with this set of strengths. You remember, I'm on this long trying to get back to your question about the education. Yeah. So we found these strengths, and then we did an analysis of what employers think the key 21st century skills and strengths are. And one of the standard ones is the 6 C's. I'll just look at them here. Coaching and counselling, collaboration and teamwork, critical thinking and problem solving, creativity and innovation, communication and persuasion, and careers and self-actualization, how to make the best of yourself. The 6 C's are thought to be the distinctive 21st century strengths. And those have an almost complete overlap with that dyslexia decathlon stuff I was talking about earlier. Those are the skills
they are.
that the employers are looking for. And so it then turns out that the skills of the dyslexic people who are distinctive for dyslexia are the ones that the employers are trying to develop in their talent management classes. And in fact, they have in their organizations the dyslexic people who already have those talents, but they're just forcing them to do something which doesn't suit them. So that got me onto, if you find some dyslexic people in your organization, get them onto your talent management, because those are the guys who will really help you with making a difference with your firm. They will give you that competitive advantage compared with those who are just using the traditional strengths. And so that got me onto the idea of talent diversity, where any organization shouldn't be all dyslexic, shouldn't be all non-dyslexic, needs a range of diversity, same with ethnic diversity, all diversities. In general, diversities, if well managed, give you a real advantage. And so that then got me around finally to answering your question. Who do we need to get to actually change the education system? We need the employers to say, actually, guys, the skills that you're developing in our school leavers are not the ones we're looking for. We also want you to develop these creativity skills. And we really need you to design a curriculum that does that. And we know that you guys can't design a curriculum that develops creativity because you haven't. So what we need to do is to have a team of dyslexic and non-dyslexic, a team of diverse talents, which is actually able to design a curriculum fit for the 21st century and fit for all of the children who are going to take it, and which they will enjoy. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable objective that everybody would buy into.
Yeah, and
it's just I haven't been able to persuade people.
Yeah, I can imagine that being a very long road for you. Hearing Rod suggest that dyslexics are perfect for the modern workplace has really caught my attention. It really resonated with me because I felt the same experiences as when I started work compared to school. School didn't suit me at all, but it felt perfectly comfortable and within my ability to be in the working environment. Rod and I continued talking. We discussed how schools can change the way they teach to support dyslexic students more effectively. We also spoke about the effect stress and negativity can have on children trying to learn. I've always been curious to know exactly what's going on in the brain of a dyslexic. Take a listen to how Rod explains it.
A question that someone asked me recently, and I didn't know the answer, maybe you can help me out with this, and I'm sure loads of people listening would love to know. What's happening in the brain? So you say you have I don't want to say normal brain, that's not the right, a non-dyslexic brain and then a dyslexic brain. What's the difference happening in there that make the two thought processes and learning abilities different?
Well, if there was a simple answer, you would have heard it by now. People have been looking, sort of trying to understand what the underlying sort of cognitive neuroscience, the differences in the brain are. There are differences. In general, the connections in the dyslexic brain will probably tend to be less fixed than in other non-dyslexic brains. Certainly, obviously, the reading circuitry in the dyslexic brain is actually quite different because it's never quite developed to that sort of that automaticity, which gets me back to our theories that the standard reader will have, that they will just recognize those words within 200 milliseconds of being able to fixate it. They will smoothly move on to the next one, and that doesn't happen with the dyslexic brain, which is in a sense it's a less well-developed skill because a 5-year-old child won't have any of those, and so in a sense all of these changes in the brain are developmental. And it's quite likely, in my view, that if one did want to develop that particular reading skill, one just took longer to do it, a dyslexic child would actually develop that skill to just as good an extent. And because of the longer window for the development of it, you get a chance to integrate later occurring skills in with it as well. And so I think a lot of the dyslexic strengths actually arise from that, what I've called delayed neural commitment, which is neural commitment is when you decide to do one thing fluently and do nothing else. If you allow a few more hooks, you can have a bigger skill and you can get a bigger picture thinking. So the stereotype brain that I would say is that what happens over time is that you develop networks in the brain, many, probably dozens, for doing things efficiently. The dyslexic, so you might think of those like canals or something. For the dyslexic brain, there's probably more, the walls of the canals are less high, they're less entrenched, and therefore you have more chance for crosstalk between them, which is good in some times, and it's really bad other times. It depends what you're trying to do. So, yeah, more crosstalk is probably quite a good characterization.
So
less automatic.
Yeah, so what would your thoughts be on different forms of education systems? I've had people say, I know there are some schools out there that cater for dyslexic people, but what's your thoughts on having actual schools that just completely change the way they teach dyslexic people and having a school dedicated to them?
Well, I've been lucky enough when I was working on dyslexia and the strengths to have a chance to have a look at quite a few of the dyslexia specific schools, especially in the States, where they do have some that really do focus purely on dyslexic people. And they have very high fees. But the kids there thrive. They do actually get the chance to explore things and to do things their own way. And those kids look really happy and often go on to be very successful. And to be honest, I think this has relatively little to do with dyslexia. I think that any child would thrive in those circumstances. I think that the idea of sitting down 30 children in one classroom and then forcing them all to do the same thing at the same time is completely outdated. As we've all seen with the lockdown, you can do so much stuff online very effectively. And you don't need to be on task, keeping quiet and doing exactly what the teacher tells you the whole time. You want to make sure that the key skills that you want to do, you develop and you succeed at them. The most critical thing in early schooling is to succeed at the tasks that you're given. If you fail at those early tasks, then that task, it could well be reading, will acquire, it will become more and more aversive. It will become like seeing a spider when you see that book. And as soon as you see it as a threat, not an opportunity, all the blood from the thinking circuitry goes away into your muscles so you can fight or fly or freeze. And therefore you are physically incapable of learning things if you see it as a threat. And that, unfortunately, I think is what's actually happening in a lot of our schools. With the best intentions, we're actually causing many children, not just dyslexic children, to fail to thrive. And that actually has knock-on effects, which actually mean it's more like an acquired learning difficulty. And so what we need to do is to make, and we have the resources with the computer stuff available, we need to make sure that all children are able to learn, especially the important early stuff, maybe slow it down a bit so that everybody keeps up. I don't think there's any advantage in speeding up too much.
No. And so with COVID happening, and a lot of the schools and universities now working remotely, do you think that's going to have a positive or negative impact on dyslexic people?
I have this rule of thumb. First, because teachers say, but how? It is a good thing. Teachers say, how can we teach dyslexic children? How do they learn?
Yeah.
And I say, how do you learn? If you can teach a dyslexic child the way you would like to be taught yourself, then that's how dyslexic children learn. Other children appear to have some learning superpower, so you can just sit them in a chair and throw information at them and they'll take it in. Dyslexic children seem to have it less well developed. All you need to do is to say, would it suit me, this way of learning? And so when you say, actually, I learn really well from YouTube, and I learn because actually it's something I want to learn. And I learn because I'm already halfway there and I've got some facts and I want to find out a bit more. That's how dyslexic children learn. It's how other children learn. That's what you've got to be able to do to get those children to learn. And we do have the environment, the YouTube, we have everything that we need for children to be able to learn more at their own speed, and to learn by being enthused rather than by being taught.
I think that's really important. If I find something interesting, I wasn't great at languages at school, but I loved languages, and I was always so engaged in the classes because it was fascinating to me. And normally the classes I'd done really well in were more hands-on classes like drama and design, craft and technology, them sort of things. However, if I did find a subject, it's like physics. I always loved physics, and that's mainly because the experiments we've done. And I realised when we used to do chemistry, I didn't like chemistry, but the second we started doing experiments, I became obsessed with chemistry and biology. So I realised that it was when you felt something was really interesting, and that was the same for me in physics, because when we first started physics, it was just numbers, and being a structural engineer now, I used to see numbers and think this is quite boring. But when you realise what them numbers mean, at the time when you just got A plus B equals C, it's like, what does that mean? But when you put some information behind it and relate it to real life, it engages you and it makes you feel you want to do something.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got somehow to get the kids engaged, haven't you? I mean, I work in the university. We're always being told, make sure your students are engaged in your lectures. And it's, in psychology, it's actually, I believe it's a very interesting subject, and therefore they should be engaged. But things like the maths and the physics are often much more difficult to get the engagement. But if you are doing something because you want to do it, because it's something which actually speaks to your own inner purposes, and you can see how it fits in, then that's just a completely different thing than I'm learning something by rote.
Well, that's why I left school straight away. I run out the school gate on my last day of school at 16. I could not wait to get to work. And the day I started work, I always say that was like my life started on that day, because I felt a sense of contribution when I started doing it, and I felt like I was achieving something. And And
Well, you probably also felt valued as well, didn't you?
yes, and we all want to feel valued, and we want. Well, it comes back to significance, doesn't it? We all want to feel significance in our life, and value falls into that area. And then when I progressed in my career and got to a certain level, I decided that I wanted to learn about more about construction and things like that. So I looked into engineering. So I went back as a mature student. That was it. So with some of seeing as you're into the psychology of it, do you think dyslexia brings any other issues when you're younger? I'll give you an example. For me, I'm still overweight now, and I'm pretty sure if you compare me to all my brothers, I ate the same. I was pretty much the same as all my brothers in every single way, and they were never overweight, but they weren't dyslexic as well. And I always said I didn't see there was a link between the two, but I spoke to someone recently, and they said exactly the same thing, that they kind of had a lot more. They struggled a lot more, because I used to be very stressed when I was younger, because I didn't find out I was dyslexic till I was quite old, and I couldn't really do my alphabet till I was 12. That was a scary thing. That was embarrassing. And I didn't start functioning well socially until my parents sent me to a dyslexic tutor, who I went to 5, and all of them said they couldn't teach me. So they kept on putting me onto another one. And in the end, my parents found one, and she changed my life. But do you think there can be some links in struggling, not necessarily dyslexic people, struggling at a young age with coping with something you don't quite understand, and it impact in other areas?
It's absolutely fundamental. Everybody needs to succeed. Nobody likes to be laughed at or to made to feel bad. If your entire school day is actually taken up with activities at which you're not shining, and you don't have anything that you are shining at, then you will get stressed. And then that's, as I said earlier, that's a vicious circle, because the stress does mean that you're not able to use as much of the brain as you need to learn effectively, which is therefore a vicious circle, and you get a knock-on effect. And after a while, your stress levels may well generalize from, shall we say, that reading class to the entire school situation. And of course, if one's stressed oneself, it gets transmitted. It's a bit like the COVID, that other people will pick up that stress. And then the effect of stressor is basically that sort of a lot of people will actually also stop working as well. And then the teacher gets stressed. And so the whole thing is a vicious circle. But the side effects of stress over an extended period are very significant. In adults having stress over a long period, you get basically burnout, where you're able to cope with it for a relatively short time, but then your resources are used up, and you can no longer cope with it. And that happens, I think, at school as well. A lot of the children that one sees, whether dyslexic or not, who are in a sense not succeeding at school, they are suffering from what I call toxic stress, which is sort of leaching out into their entire life. And that's one of the things that which prevents learning. It may well also get back to the side effects you were saying. It may well be that overeating will be one of the responses to stress. There's a whole range of adverse responses to stress.
So what would you say to maybe a parent that's listening? What's a good method? If obviously we can't change the situation of schools overnight, and they're going to be an ever longer process of trying to change them. So what's a good method for parents with children, or even adults themselves, when they're I think we adapt well as adults, but what's a good method to get out of that? Is it to go and focus on something you're good at and take the positive out of it?
That's I think exactly. Well, it's being aware of the negatives, but B, trying to move towards the light, to move towards the positives, and realizing, in fact, that there are many areas where one does actually have strengths. It's just that they happen not to be the ones which are being highlighted at school. And so what we've tried to do is to bring out a sort of a strengths finder, so that you can find your own personal best, even if it's not great. if it's the one that you're doing the best, and in a sense, the one where when you're doing it, you don't notice anything else. You get that feeling of flow, that an hour has gone past and you've not noticed anything else. That will be one of your strengths. Find out what you really enjoy doing and try to craft your life so you spend a bit more time that you're doing the things that you enjoy, which almost certainly be the ones that you get better and better at. And acknowledge that there are things that you're going to have to work hard at, and try to be organised to get them, but just don't expect to enjoy it.
I totally agree with Rod about focusing on the positives of dyslexia and avoiding the negatives. In school, it felt that we focused on the things I really struggled with, and it was very hard to progress. I got the opportunity to speak to Rod about how dyslexics are viewed at work and what employers can do to become more dyslexic and neurodiverse friendly. For a while now, I've been wondering whether failure as a dyslexic has made me more resilient. Rod, shed some light on this for me.
The one consistent thing that keeps on coming up to most people I speak about when we talk about this subject is failure. So everyone seems to agree that because when you're younger, as a dyslexic, you're generally failing more than your peers who don't have it. So as you transfer into a younger adult, you have higher confidence levels and you have the ability to not worry too much, adapt well to stressful situations like we spoke about earlier. Is that something that most dyslexic have, or is it just seems to be a pattern that I'm noticed forming between people?
Well, there's two bits to this. There's failure and there's shame. That shaming failure is really toxic. And a lot of the schools seem to be set up to have shaming failure. In terms of the history, if you have actually had quite a bit of experience of having setbacks and having made your way around them, which is in a sense what you're talking about there, then actually this is a situation that you're used to. Whereas to take my son, he was something like 12 before the first time he wasn't able to do something at school. And he was completely devastated. He was completely devastated. He had no coping strategies whatsoever. I mean, you'll find this amusing, but you can see that if you've actually had practice in a situation, which gets me onto that sort of flexible coping sort of skill, then it really can be helpful, because however well you do at school, when you move into the world, it's a very different environment.
Yeah.
And you will actually experience a range of situations for which you have had no experience. And the more flexibly you can cope with that, the better. And you will get reverses. And so it can be useful.
I think for me, the one thing everyone always says about me is I don't really have any fear. And I always say it's not so much fear. I fear as much as everyone else, because we all have responsibilities. If I was to lose, and it could quite easily happen, if I was to lose everything tomorrow, people have the fear of embarrassment about other people's opinions on the matter. Well, I feel like I've dealt with that when I was younger, because when you're standing up in class having to read out loud and you're standing there crying your eyes out because you can't read the words on the page, or they're asking you to do times tables or any small sums, and it's your biggest fear in the world. You already have it. You're already facing your biggest fears of public shame in the only thing that matters to you at your age, which is your friends and classmates. And I just think it's a powerful thing to take into the adult world, that you've got this resilience.
Yes. In a sense, you've been pre-toughened, haven't you? I mean, no one would recommend this as a method. It's a bit like the army, isn't it? You start off with dreadful experiences, and the rest of it's not so bad.
Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't recommend it, but if you could somehow allow children to experience a range of areas where they don't cope. For me, it was metalwork, to be honest. I really couldn't do it. I think it does toughen you up. It does give you that resilience that allows you to bounce back. But for that, you need to have reasonably high self-esteem, I think, as well. And I think that's one of the things that we really do need to build, especially in many of the dyslexic children who don't go on to do as well as I feel they should. So it's that self-esteem is a really difficult one.
So what's currently going on with you at the moment? What are you up to at the moment in regards to dyslexia? Apart from obviously you're probably very busy lecturing timetable.
Well, I am the head of the department, and so my job is to make sure that everything moves smoothly for this next period of lectures starting in a couple of weeks, which is, of course, it does test one's resilience.
Yeah.
But in terms of the dyslexia, I worked on dyslexia as a disability for a long time, finding methods of screening for what quickly how we could find, and then we could support people's support for success rather than for failure. But I also, and then I moved on to the positive dyslexia. What are the strengths? And then I've come round to realise that what you need is a more balanced overall approach, which I call, with friends in the Netherlands, Dyslexia 360, where you try to look at it from all perspectives: strengths and weaknesses, successes and stresses, the past and especially the future. In the case of a university, not just your degree, but what sort of job you're going to get into. And then from the point of view of society as well, how can we actually rebrand dyslexia so that it is perceived correctly as a potential talent to manage? And that I think that 360 actually fits in very well with a dyslexic personality, because one does tend to not just sort of go too focused on one thing, but to be able to see the bigger picture. So for the Dyslexia 360 in the university, I've been trying to develop what I call the dyslexia-friendly university, which actually introduces things which are actually benefits that moves towards the career. Hey, look, you're really good at that big picture thinking. How can you develop your talents in university? How can we get the employers on board so that they are looking for people with that range of talents? So it's that sort of thing. Unfortunately, all of this effort on my part has been overtaken by the coronavirus, where the universities have stopped trying to be friendly to anyone. They're really trying to keep the ship afloat at the moment. But it is that sort of stuff. And so from the point of view, so what we developed is a thing called what we should call a diverse work strengths finder, which is trying to find potential strengths that people don't realize that they have, which will then help them to get into the right careers. Something that's easily done by yourself or at school by the teacher, so that they begin to see this child not as a problem dyslexic child, but as a child with talent that needs to be developed in the right way. And so this is a difficult task. I think it's terribly hard to move education, but I do think it's possible to move business, because they know, the captains of business know very well that they need a different type of person to be able to cope with the 21st century. And I think they will be the ones that we need to rely on to ask the educationalists to move the goalposts into something which is more appropriate for today's society.
I suppose it will stem all from the corporate companies, because they're the ones with the bigger budgets in order to enable these sort of conversations. And once these corporations get on board, like you say, I think it will filter through to what we need.
Well, that's what I hope. We did some studies of companies, corporate companies, big ones, saying, what is your view of dyslexia? And many of them came out with basically, yes, dyslexia is a disability. We need to accommodate it. We make sure to all of our HR policies actually give the dyslexic people the support they need, but hardly any came out with it in the sense what I think of as the right view. The dyslexic people for us are the way that give us our cutting edge, and we need to manage them. And it turned out that those who actually did have some of a much more positive view, if you say, well, why is that? Well, you say, one of our directors is dyslexic, and as I said, I'm dyslexic. This is what we're looking for. And I do feel that's so important, to have that role model, someone that you can look up to in the corporate structure. And so I think that.
So would you say the perception of dyslexia as a whole still probably has a long way to go with the general work environment?
Well, I think in a sense, in some ways, it got hoisted by the approach that we took in the 90s, getting it classified as a disability. because then that gave the financial support for the initiatives. But then when you talk about something as a disability, it has a negative connotation. And we need to, in a sense, to go through a rebranding. This is actually a potential talent, a diverse talent that we have too little of in today's society, and we need to develop more. And if you can see it from that perspective, it's not really a disability, it's just that the way we happen to be doing our teaching that's causing it to come out badly. Then that's a very different perspective.
Yeah, and if you hold it up to a standard that makes it a disability, it's not going to be ever accepted by the general public as something else. And I think someone said to me, made a really good point on the podcast the other day. She said she had she was on the spectrum as well, and she was saying about ADHD people. ADHD in children's terrible. It's very hard to control, and it can be really hard. However, ADHD in a multiple business owner is an asset. You know, you can juggle lots of things at once, and it's not stressful, and it functions better for you.
I think this comes into the sort of the talent diversity idea. With attention deficit, you have strengths and you have weaknesses. Try to craft your life so that you're spending more time on your strengths, and realizing that these really are strengths, because that's one of the key problems for all of us, not realizing what our strengths are. Because as I said earlier, it's easy to see what one's weaknesses are, but it's much harder to see what one's strengths are.
I think it's in human nature. It goes back to our more primitive brains, where we're always looking for the danger in everything. And because we don't have to run from lions or anything anymore, or anything dangerous, we focus on the negative things, whether it be society or what we do as people. And I think we sometimes forget to focus on the strengths.
Well, the problem is that things like anger and threat take over the brain, if you see what I mean, and often the responses to them actually exacerbate the situation, make you feel more threatened and more angry, which is and it's disabling a lot of the thinking circuits within the brain when you get to that stage. And a lot of the difficulties with social media, as you say, are that these can arrive from anywhere. You don't need to have a lion in your house. You know, you have a source of threat and anger in your house with all from anywhere, and that can lead to this adrenaline in your system the whole time, which is actually extremely bad for you. You have no means of actually reducing that stress. You need to go out and have a run. Tell yourself a joke. You know, something you have to be able to reduce the stress, and that's one of the most important things to be able to do.
One last question for you. What advice would you give to a parent that's not quite sure what to do about a dyslexic child, where they're probably worrying more than the child themselves, which is quite common?
How old would you like the child to be?
12 or 14. They've got big choices in their life.
12 or 14.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting age, of course, early teens. The thing to do, first, acknowledge the stresses, that these are actually real stresses, and that they will do their best to acknowledge them and to support them. They do arise often in the school area. So acknowledge stresses, make them realize what effect the stress is having upon them. It's not them. This is just their situation that's difficult. The second thing is, what are you good at? What are your strengths? Third thing is to give some role models of successful dyslexic people. Of course, there are very many now. And I think probably at that age, one of the things I would say is that actually puberty is a time of enormous brain reorganization. Many dyslexic people actually completely overcome some of their problems post 12, 13, 14, because the brain, all the networks are reconfiguring themselves, obviously to look around various more risk-taking stuff and more sex-based stuff. There's a whole range of things, but the brain is reconfiguring itself, and this is exactly the time to strike, to actually start developing their interests, the thing that they find really interesting. So the world is open for them. Is basically, it doesn't matter about the past. Acknowledge the past, but move forward.
Brilliant. Love that. That was great. That was great advice. It's exactly what I wanted you to say. So, if people wanted to find you, Rod, where could they find you? If they were looking for information about you or what you're going to be doing?
Yeah, if you type in Rod Nicolson with no H in Nicholson, it will find me at Edge Hill University.
Mm-hmm.
Email me. I always reply. I can't solve all problems, but I try.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for coming on the show. It's been fascinating for me. It's been a very exciting one, and you haven't disappointed.
No, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for some great questions. A really interesting discussion, actually.
Thank you very much.
Good luck with the rest of the series.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed hearing Rod's unique insight into dyslexia. I think this episode has a real place in the first season of this podcast. Rod's positivity and insight into dyslexia, I think, is going to be a real inspiration for all dyslexics around the world. I've learned so much on today's episode. It's been a real eye-opener for me. Rod, thanks so much for your time, and I hope you continue to do such groundbreaking work that's really important to our community. Coming up on next week's episode, Philip Schultz. It's a privilege to have Philip on the podcast. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, and it's a huge deal for me to have him on the podcast. Just a couple of quick notes before we go, they're important ones. First off, make sure to subscribe to The Invisible Gift wherever you listen to podcasts so you can automatically be notified about new episodes. One thing that's really important to me is to hear what you guys think about the podcast. I want to hear more about the challenges you're facing, what you're trying to change in your own life, work and family, and hear your inspiring stories of how you've overcome the odds to achieve the incredible. I know because so many of you are dyslexic that asking you to write something to me is not going to work. So I've worked with the production team on The Invisible Gift and we've come up with an idea. Grab your phone and record us a voice note. If you've got an iPhone, use voice memos. On Android, the options are endless. Once you're happy with your message, you can email it to me. My email address is andrew@theinvisiblegift.com. I would love to start sharing some of your audio notes and stories in future episodes. Also, and I'm really excited about this, head to theinvisiblegift.com because that way you can see the amazing artwork that has been commissioned to go along with each episode this season, and also find out more about each of the guests I've had the pleasure of speaking to on the podcast. If all of this is way too much for you, I get it. I'm starting a newsletter that includes all this and more, and it will come straight to your inbox. It's so simple to sign up at theinvisiblegift.com. You've been listening to the Invisible Gift podcast, presented by me, Andrew Kitley, and produced by One Fine Play. This episode was recorded by Kazra. From One Fine Play, James Bishop is the executive producer. Kazra is the audio and visual engineer. Connor Foley is the editorial producer and researcher. Special thanks to Christina, Izzy, and the Cube Studios. Thank you for listening to the Invisible Gift podcast.